Okay, so there's a new big autopsy out about the Democratic Party and how they fared in 2020. And it's sort of a weird thing because Democrats won the White House, they won the Senate, they maintained control of the House, but it's still seen as like they wildly underperformed expectations.
Which they did. Yeah.
So a number of groups got together and went through to say like, okay, here's what went wrong and here are the warning signs for the future. Let's throw this New York Times tear sheet up there on the screen. And basically, first of all, you need to know that one of the groups that was most involved with this was Third Way. Centrist think tank, they hate the left. They take every opportunity that they can to trash the left. So keep in mind when you're reading the details here that there's like an ideological agenda behind it. And keeping with that, some of what they say is useful and some of it is clearly very ideologically motivated. So here were their sort of top findings. Number one, voters of color are persuasion voters who need to be convinced. And this to me was maybe like the biggest takeaway is that Democrats were assuming that minority voters were just automatically in their camp. And all they needed to do was worry about turning them out. So there was no persuasion pitch. There was no effort to actually go into these communities and be like, here's why you should vote for Joe Biden. Here's why you should vote for the Democratic Party. They just took these voters for granted. That's the bottom line, which does reflect what Chuck Roach has been telling us forever about the total underinvestment in Latino communities. And what they also came up with was that, no brainer, Democrats lacked an economic pitch that was effective. They didn't lean in. They leaned too much into just like Trump is bad messaging, which everybody can judge for themselves and could experience and witness for themselves, however they felt about Donald Trump. And so the fact that there wasn't a coherent economic message meant that Republicans were effective at portraying Democrats as like the party of lockdowns, that they just want to keep you in your house forever and keep the schools closed and keep your masks on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The part it's funny because most of the report is very data driven. And they've got all these charts and here's the turnout percentage and all of this. And then the part where they're like, oh, it was all the left's fault. It's all anecdotal. It's like, you know, we asked Abigail Spanberger and she said it's the left's fault, right? I also would say though, and we've talked about this before, there's no ability to distinguish between the sort of like economic left
and the
policies
cultural left,
and the cultural left. And look, I'm, from a values perspective, I'm totally aligned with both the economic and cultural left. But if you just look at the polling and look what lands, there's no doubt that the economic policies are more popular. And also, if your whole beef is like, they lacked a coherent economic message, well, literally the only part of the party that has a coherent economic message is the left. So that part seemed to be very, very thin. But it's interesting, and they basically say, look, Democrats could really be in trouble in 2022.
I think the parsing of it is very important because you're right. And look, I think the cultural left is 100% to blame for both the current state of American politics in terms of the division and really in terms of the Democratic underperformance in 2020. And the only thing that saved them was really Trump and his complete and total idiocy. But if you want to see a picture of the future, my own home state of Texas, let's put this up there on the screen. McAllen, Texas, an 85% Hispanic town on the border. And I mean, when I say on the border, I mean literally on the border. That is what it is. Just elected a Republican mayor, which shows actually that the Republican gains in South Texas are going to stay despite the fact that Trump was on the ballot. So yes, Trump was on the ballot, the stimulus checks and all of that, but something oceanic has happened down in South Texas. And I think that what it does show you is what we speak about all the time, which are there are Hispanic voters in South Texas who are like pro-Medicare for all, pro-life, pro-gun, and anti-PC, anti-establishment. What party speaks to them? Not the national GOP, certainly not the National Democratic Party, but on a localized level, this is what the future of politics looks like. I'm not going to say it's what the future of GOP. What it is that they are recognizing that the national brands of both of the parties are totally out of step with these brand new constituencies. And I would say that the reason why the Republican Party, if anything, can be the mantle, why some of this is going to be seen, at least in the emerging time, is because they don't stand for anything. So the people down there can make it stand for whatever they need to. In the future, the Democratic Party could too. I don't know.
Well, you know, having lived in Ohio and Kentucky and done work in West Virginia, local politics is dead. Everything is nationalized now. And you really can't escape. Like, if the Democratic Party brand is trash, there's no escaping it. If the Republican Party brand is trash, there's no escaping it. You're going to be tarred with Stop the Steal at every single level in the Republican Party.
For the suburban voters, for sure.
Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you live, but you're not going to be able to escape that. And for the Democratic Party, I mean, this is why they've lost all of rural America, and why even candidates who, you know, had a long history in some of these seats and were really well known among the population, that's why they haven't been able to make up any ground there or even have these sort of like outlier races anymore, because there's just this aura of contempt and condescension coming from the National Party that you cannot escape, which is why, you know, all these, and this is what's really depressing, any sort of like individual candidate qualities, or like, oh, what platform does this particular candidate run on, or like what's their bio and how do they relate, or how do they have deep roots in the district? All of that stuff matters almost not at all.
Right.
Right.
No,
so
you're correct.
And that's actually, and so that's the national brand is everything that matters. And so, you know, I think you have these two choices that are both like lackluster and anemic in very different ways. And I do want to say on the, like, you know, blaming defund the police for all Democratic underperformance, I think that's very convenient for the Democratic establishment.
Sure.
I'm not going to say that it didn't have any impact at all, but guess what? Joe Biden could have run on a platform, right? He could have run on like, hey, here's what I'm actually going to do for you economically. Here's the healthcare plan that I'm actually going to push for. He stopped even talking about the public option.
No, this is a very
once he won the nomination.
It's very easy for Spanberger.
It's very easy for Spanberger and these other blue dogs, or for the Biden team or whatever, to be like, oh, it was all the fault of these activists saying defund the police, because that keeps them from having to do a single moment of soul searching about the fact that they did not offer an economic agenda that was coherent for people, and they continue to not learn the lessons of 2016, that it's not enough to just lean into like, oh, Trump is bad.
Well, and they're learning that the hard way. Look, I think defund the police is absolutely responsible for the state of Florida and for a lot of South Texas. That being said, it's not the only thing. And you're right, which is that whenever everything is very complicated. Coalitions are difficult, which is that why do millions of people come out and vote? Many of them can't even really tell you themselves. Be like, oh, maybe I did it for this, maybe I did it for that. At the end of the day, sometimes it's about a gut feeling. But I do think that it does lie with this. Neither candidate of 2020 proposed any transformative way in order to change your life. So what did it come down to? Of course the default was culture, right? If there was no argument around how you're going to remake American society, then of course we're going to default to defund the police or immigration or anything else. That, yes, we can say those are the top issues in people's lives, but also things are downstream from each other. When Trump is out there saying his economic agenda in 2020 was, I'm going to cut Social Security and pass another large tax cut. That's literally what he said.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, awesome. And then Biden, I don't even know what the hell he was running on. I mean,
Restore the soul of America.
Restore the soul of
Literally
America,
means nothing.
which again doesn't actually mean anything. So in that particular case, it does. Of course, it makes sense to me, which is that you're going to have a default cultural election. So we have cultural doomerism right now in America, where everybody's like, the culture war rules everything, and I've said it here many times. But it's because we have the absence of political parties speaking to the actual economic and societal problems of the 21st century. Now, in the year 1932, you know what they didn't have to argue about? Culture. And it wasn't just because it was a homogenous society. It was about what is the government role in the Great Depression. We were owed that this time around, and we completely lost it. Some of these books behind here are exactly about what happened back then. And it makes me so sad to see the way that our politics works today.
This is actually what my breaking points are about today. I'm going to have to get used to saying that. Radar is very ingrained in my brain. But this is what it's about, because it's not just in the U.S. Across 21 different Western democracies that Thomas Piketty and some of his colleagues studied, you've had this, what they call multi-party elite system. So on the right, you have the financial elites, and on the left, you have the education elites, like people who have college degree and higher degrees. And so that means you have every party dominated by various elites who continue to pursue their own class interests, which means that economics is essentially taken off the table. And what all the fights are over is culture. And that's very easy and it's very convenient for, like, you know, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party establishment. They don't have to do anything other than say the right words and signal the right things. So that is the state of our politics. Does it have to be that way? No.
No.
And even today, there are exceptions. There are countries that are exceptions to that rule. But the more that you focus on just like this sort of like gauzy, meaningless rhetoric, rather than a concrete, actionable policy plan, the more you're just going to have these fights over culture.
I think
And
you're
that is what we see.
That's absolutely correct. One of the core themes I think we're going to track in the future is just how much the culture war is ripping us apart and to what end and why. And I really do blame the people at the top. I do not blame the voters whatsoever, and I never will.